Warning. The following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Hot Takes with Billy Biz. Today we're talking about Ridley Scott's 2012 Prometheus in the Alien saga. But before we get to that, exciting news. I think a lot of you have heard this. We are going to be at LA Comic-Con. Who's we, you ask? Me and the boys from the Nerd Goat podcast. That's right, Ron Swallow, producer Bill, and Ed Greer, who you've heard us on the Commute Killers. We are doing a live show at LA Comic-Con October 13th. Be there or be square rooted for you math nerds. We are going to be doing a show called Reboot It. A lot of times you hear that they're rebooting a movie and you go, no, but what if you had to reboot it? You had no choice. We will be the ones figuring out how to reboot these franchises in a limited series. First episode live at Comic-Con. We're doing Batman, how we would reboot the Batman series. Please be there because I don't want to show up to an empty room like my 7th grade birthday party. So, with that being said, today we are talking about Ridley Scott's Prometheus, and joining me, I'm actually very, very, very excited because I've been telling you guys, I've been evangelicalizing, that's kind of a word. I've been Billy Gramming you guys about this podcast, Hey Do You Remember? The host is joining me, or one of the three hosts, Chris Schrader. Chris, thanks for hopping on, man.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I was a little nervous to have you on, not just because I'm a big fan of your show, but also because I'm fairly sure I've taken some of your movie thoughts and passed them off as my own, and I don't want to be caught on this episode. I think it was one of your Mighty Ducks episodes where you're like the hierarchy is all wrong here in terms of heightening, where it's like, it's Pee-wee Olympics school.
yeah.
Just. But today
it would be really bizarre if Mighty Ducks kept coming up during this episode. I don't know how much crossover there's going to be between the Mighty Ducks and the Alien franchise. But
I think there's probably more than you think. There's probably some Goldberg things in both of these movies. I'm not sure. But we are talking about Prometheus, which is the prequel to Alien. This came out in 2012. I don't know about you, but I remember when this movie came out, I was not a big Alien fan. I think I'd seen the first two Alien and Aliens, like the year before this came out. Cause I'm a pussy. I'm very scared, very scared of a lot of things. And I went with my friend who showed me the Alien movies, and he didn't just dislike this movie. He was like angry, like to the point where we were driving home. And I was like, dude, you got to stop taking it out on me. Like, I know you're mad, but like you're starting to like yell at me personally. I don't know how, cause you're a big Alien fan of most of the franchise, right?
Well, the first Alien is in my top 5 favorite movies of all time. I think it's a masterpiece. Alien's also very good. Over the years, I've grown to appreciate Alien 3 quite a bit. It's a mess, but there's enough of David Fincher and the filmmaker he was going to become in there that there's still a lot I like about that one. And then it's just a really steep fall off after that. So
yeah, I mean, I think after I watched Prometheus, I was like, oh, cool, I should watch those Alien versus Predator movies. Woof.
Yeah, what's crazy, too, is even the first time I saw Prometheus, how similar the first act of this is to the first Alien versus Predator movie, which I that's got to be because I think they're both drawing inspiration from that Lovecraft story At the Mountains of Madness. I think that's why, but if you go back, it's a lot of weird similarities between Prometheus and the first AVP.
I mean, just in terms of like intellectual bandwidth, it's like Prometheus, I really have to stop and think about. Alien versus Predator, I'm like, I need to like question my choices and how I'm spending my time. But let's talk a little bit. Let's get into the context of how kind of this came to be, because there were talks for a long time about what would be the 5th film in the Alien franchise. And by 2002, Ridley Scott was like, yeah, maybe I'll come back. And even James Cameron was kind of like, I've got this script, I've got this idea. Then Fox, in their infinite wisdom, was like, guys, what if we did this Alien versus Predator thing? I think James Cameron was like, nah, you're donezo, I'm donezo, not going to do that. So they put out the Alien versus Predator 2. I actually don't know if those were box office successes or not. Certainly not critical successes. That being said, they came back to this, and that's where Ridley Scott was developing his Alien prequel. And then Damon Lindelof comes along. And a lot of people, I'm a big Lost fan. I don't know about you. Really enjoy Lost, but a lot of people throw the blame at J.J. Abrams a lot for Lost. He can't finish everything. A lot of those mystery box things, those are Damon Lindelof. Okay. Yeah, Damon Lindelof, he's like the guy that was driving the Lost ship. So when he came on, people were anxious. This was just after Lost had kind of wrapped up. It was a finale that divided most of the fandom of that show. So he comes on, and then they start going on this weird back and forth press tour as the movie is starting to come out of. It's not an alien film, but it kind of is an alien film. Sort of, but no, not at all, but kind of, but a little bit, but not at all. So we all went into this movie like, is it an alien movie? Yes and no. And to this movie's credit, it was considered a financial success. It didn't make as much as they thought it would domestically, but in foreign, it made it combined with foreign, it made like almost $500 million. So it had 74% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It had a B cinema score. I think younger audiences liked it better. I think they gave it an A-. So it's like, okay, on paper, this movie reads like, yeah, this should be like a movie that we all kind of remembered and revered. And you bring up Prometheus now, and it's a lot of eye rolling. So kind of, I want to get your thoughts because, like I said, I wasn't a big Alien fan going into this. You kind of were. What were your thoughts hearing that there was going to be a prequel, and kind of your thoughts around that, and then actually getting to see it?
So I'm not generally a huge fan of prequels. Like especially with Alien, the idea of going back and explaining where the xenomorph came from, I just thought like, oh man, don't do that. I mean, that's central to why that franchise works as well as it does, why that first film has the staying power that it does. Don't undo all of that. And then, it's tempered by the fact that it's Ridley Scott and him returning. That was really, really exciting. And I don't know if you remember this, but 2012 was a big summer for movies. There was the Avengers, The Dark Knight Rises, and I don't know if you've picked up on this, Billy, but I'm a little bit of a Batman fan.
Just a smidge,
a tiny bit. It comes up every once in a while on my show. So this was the summer of the concluding chapter of the Dark Knight trilogy, and even still, the movie I was most excited for was this. It was Prometheus.
And probably Christopher Nolan was in the same boat as you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's not only Ridley Scott's return to this franchise, but to sci-fi in general. And so I was really into that. I thought the first trailer for this was incredible. I'm normally not a person that rewatches trailers over and over and over again. I see one, I'm like, that was great. They've got my money. I can't wait. This was one that I kept going back to and just analyzing and looking at these like split seconds of footage of what is that? What does it mean? I was really, really into it. As anxious as I was to see this, I had to wait a couple of weeks because this series, this had always been something that I'd shared with my dad. So leading up to the release of this, he sent me a text that said, don't you dare go see that movie until I can get down there, because we've seen all these alien movies together, which I was happy to do, but that meant going out of my way to try and avoid spoilers. But what I couldn't avoid, as hard as I tried to, was getting some sense of the reaction that other people were having to the movie. So I think I got my disappointment out of the way weeks before I actually saw the film. Like, my expectations had been sufficiently lowered. And so there's no question that played a huge part in my reaction to the film once I finally saw it, because I went into this expecting something much worse. I had been led to believe this was going to be like a Phantom Menace level whiff. And maybe for some people it was, but I walked out of the theater feeling like the hyperbole surrounding this had just gotten a little bit out of control, because I don't know if it's always been this way or this is just something I'm noticing more and more as I get older, but it feels like with these big tentpole movies, like I said, it's hyperbolic, but in both directions. These things are either the best thing ever or they're the worst thing ever. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for just pretty good anymore. And quite frankly, there are a lot of C+ blockbusters, and that's okay. That's a passing grade. And that's what Prometheus is for me. It's a mixed bag. It has a lot of problems, but there's also a lot that I enjoy about it. And I know we'll probably get into some of our big grievances as we go along here. But, my first reaction to it, I think my main problem with the film, right from that first viewing, was they really needed to pick a lane when it came to their intentions for this, because there's a version of this that very much could have been a direct prequel to the first Alien, which John Spaihts' original script for this definitely was before Damon Lindelof was brought in. The other option was to be a completely original, standalone science fiction movie that had nothing at all to do with the Alien franchise, just a brand new IP from Ridley Scott. Instead, what we have here is a movie that feels like it's trying to be both of those things at the same time. And that's a little bit frustrating because I think fully committing to either one would have resulted in a stronger film. So
it's interesting that you say that because, my friends over at the Force Center podcast, they have this ideology that they carry of speculate responsibly. And I think this all came out of Last Jedi, where it's a lot of people go into these movies, especially prequels and sequels that are that big, of I've been dreaming about what this is for so long that when you show up to these movies and it's not that, it's almost hard to take the movie for what it is because it's not what you imagine that it should have been in your headcanon of all this stuff. So I think for me, I hear where you're coming from with the pick a lane thing. And I think I just, by sheer ignorance is bliss, kind of fell into the second category of it felt like a new IP to me because I'd only seen those movies once a year before. I think, there's imagery that stuck with me from Alien specifically. But the whole engineer thing, it just wasn't something that I really, I don't know, if you had shown me the two frames side by side, I probably didn't even remember that was part of the Alien thing. I think I remembered some of the more visceral, kind of guttural, the thing popping out of the chest imagery than I did something like that. So when I approached Prometheus, and by the way, I saw this in maybe the coolest way that you can see a movie. This was, I think, the first movie I ever saw at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood on opening weekend. I did take it as something new. And so for me, I think a lot of this foot isn't firmly in the pool of Alien. It never quite bothered me. I'm like, that's okay. This is kind of its own story for me. And then I can really digest on the themes of what this movie is trying to say, which, to be fair, a lot of those questions, people are very upset because they didn't either get answers or get the answers they wanted. But I kind of want to ask, that's to me, one of my big points of why I like this movie is we had seen so many alien invasion movies, not just the Alien series, just aliens in general, where they are another race and we are either trying to find them or they find us. And I love that this one is a quest for our creation, bringing kind of the religious motifs into it. I'm sure there's probably other alien sci-fi movies that have tackled this same thing, but for me, this was the first time that I kind of seen that twist on it.
Yeah, I actually really love that about the film, that it, for the first time in a long time, specifically in the context of this franchise, this did feel, when it started, this was a real film. This wasn't just going to be kind of a greatest hits checklist of iconography from the other Alien movies, which a lot of the sequels had turned into. This felt like it was doing something brand new. And I was really on board for that. And I have to say that, the fact that there aren't xenomorphs or face huggers or more of the traditional alien stuff in this, that's not what disappointed me at all. I would have been totally into that. In fact, the approach they settled on here of well, let's do a story set in the same universe, but with no direct ties to any of the stuff we've already explored. I think that's a great idea, but that's one of the other things that I think if you're going to go that route, you have to take it one step further than what they did here, because there's too many holdovers from when this was a direct prequel to Alien. It's like they can slap a new skin on it. They can change the names and some of the creature designs, but the skeleton of that Alien prequel that John Spates wrote, you can still see that underneath. Like, you can tell this was supposed to be LV-426.
Sure.
That was supposed to be the alien spacecraft that the crew of the Nostromo discovers. Like, if there had been less of, that structure still there, if it truly just had been, hey, here's something else that's happening in another corner of this universe, I think that's a great way to approach it. But yeah, again, I guess I'm just coming back to that same idea of pick a lane. But I do agree completely that the ambitions of this film, it is one thing I really do admire about this, and something that, whether or not, I know we'll get into how successfully they follow through on some of the questions they raise. Spoilers, not very. But still, that ambition alone makes this more interesting for me than a lot of the other Alien sequels.
Yeah, I think that's why, and you brought this up, you guys did a Patreon episode where you talked about unpopular opinions, and you brushed on this a little bit with Prometheus, but I think that to me was like the biggest downfall of Alien Covenant, was that to me was like, okay, that is a clear example of pick a lane, because
right.
Ridley Scott wanted to make a very different movie than clearly Fox wanted him to make. And he's like, I'll make both in the same. And it does not work for me, where I feel like this movie, at least to me, did not have that much of the egregious, two-faced split down the middle. But it also does bum me out that this movie does ask those interesting questions, like, why did the engineers make humans, and why are they so angry with them? And there's a part of me that, like, I get it. You want those questions answered because they like very overtly ask them. But there's kind of a part of me that likes that I have to fill in a lot of those blanks kind of with my own thoughts, with my own like imagination. I get it. It sounds like I'm making excuses for this, but it's better than what was already there, because as I'm sure there was a very overt piece of the script that was omitted where, they are mad at humans because they sent someone to kind of check in on the humans, and it turned out to be Jesus 2,000 years ago. And this whole quest for revenge was for the death of Jesus. I'm like, I don't like that. But I do like this idea, at least in my head, of like, well, it's kind of like tying back to the themes of David in the movie, where he's kind of like, why did you create me? Because we could. And it's like that kind of arrogance of like, they wake up this engineer and here's this robot that's talking to him. He's just looking at him like, what arrogant little pricks you have become. Get out of my sight. We need to get rid of my creation. Like, I don't know. I guess I didn't walk away feeling like, what is happening? What does it all mean? Like, it kind of seemed like the DNA was all there.
So rewatching the movie last night, there are slightly more answers given than I remembered about the engineers. And I don't need the movie to answer all of those questions, but I think another thing that struck me last night when I was watching it was asking questions is not the same thing as exploring them. So even if Prometheus raises a lot of these really interesting thematic, spiritual questions, it doesn't have to give definitive answers on them. I would rather it not actually, but it just kind of name checks a lot of things. Nolan does this a little bit too in a lot of his movies, but it made me realize that, ambiguity is such a big part of why the original Alien works as well as it does. But Prometheus, by design, is a very different movie with very different goals. Alien is about the fear of the unknown. Prometheus is kind of about the unknown of the unknown. And, like I said, I don't mind that it doesn't answer every question, but the big difference is that there is a very linear progression to Alien. It does answer some questions as it goes along, specifically about the life cycle of the creature. And perhaps most importantly, it tells you everything you need to know to become invested in that story. But that's not what Prometheus does. It's a grab bag of ideas and imagery that, while very intriguing, they don't totally coalesce. And so even though Alien may not spell out every last detail for you, it is a complete story that answers its central question of whether or not this crew is going to survive. And it has such skillful world building and ignites your imagination in such a way that you leave the theater, kind of daydreaming and still thinking about all the details that it deliberately didn't fill in, that it leaves up to you. But to me, Prometheus is not a complete story. And what I really felt that on this most recent viewing was this is a 2-hour first act. It's sort of a feature-length tease for a more interesting story. And I think this is a good first act to that larger story. But I also sympathize with people who got to the end of this and sort of felt like, well, what was even the point then? And you brought up Alien Covenant, and that's the thing. Now I feel doubly let down,
right?
Because until that movie came out, I really did think that the next film might redeem a lot of the issues people had with this one. That maybe once we had some sense of what the bigger picture was and saw how Prometheus fit into that, it would be easier to forgive how incomplete this one felt. But yeah, that is not what happened. Covenant just makes an even bigger mess of the whole thing.
Oh, they it almost goes out of its way to poo-poo everything that they set up in the first one. Then we just showed up where the engineers were and I killed them real fast. Don't worry about it.
It's so crazy. It's I already said on that episode that we did, it feels like a movie that's for no one. If you went in as one of the people that was legitimately interested in a Prometheus sequel, it's not that. If you were somebody who wanted a more straightforward Alien movie, it's the most half-hearted, dispassionate. You can tell Ridley Scott just does not care about that side of it anymore. It's just, it's such a bummer.
I like your point, and I understand where you're coming from with the mixed bag thing, because as much as I do like a lot of themes of this movie, I think one kind of theme that they put in the movie and then they back off is this idea of Shaw is very religious and she's got that cross, and it's well, what if your idea of religion is just shattered before your very eyes and taken away from you? And she's just put in such a position where it's she's fighting for her survival, so she can't really stop to do a monologue about how praying to God doesn't make sense to her anymore. I guess actually saying that line if she's running from something, which she at least was smart enough to roll to the left or to the
yeah,
right.
Oh my God.
Let's talk about that for a second, because as I say every episode, with very few exceptions, I don't believe any movie is 100% perfect or 100% irredeemable. There are things that I really love about this movie and some things that just make me smack my head. Vickers is one where I still don't quite understand what that character is trying to tell me in this movie. I don't understand what it's about.
Yeah, when I was watching it last night, I thought wow, you could pretty much remove this character completely, and I don't think that much about the film changes.
Yeah, I understand it's she's kind of lurking in the background and she's ice cold, but we maybe kind of pick up that it's some weird daddy issues because he loves this robot more than her, but it's so tossed in there for literally half a second at the end that you're huh? And then yes, maybe one of the dumbest Looney Tunes Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote deaths in an otherwise fairly good movie. I'm whoa, how did you whiff this so hard?
So speaking of Damon Lindelof, I do have to say that, he makes a very convenient punching bag for this, and understandably so, I guess. But, from the more I've read about the making of this film, it sounds less like Damon Lindelof came in and took that John Spates draft and then just said yeah, this is pretty good. Let me just wipe my ass with it. It was he's sounds like he was just following the marching orders that Ridley Scott gave him, that it was Ridley Scott who was the one that was kind of demanding less and less connective tissue to the Alien movies. And so I know that Lindelof, when they asked him what he thought of the Spates script, he did say on his own, before he knew why he'd been hired, I think the weakest part of this script is how much it relies on the first Alien movie. Okay, so that's a little bit on him, but then it very much was Ridley Scott saying like, yeah, let's just make it more ambiguous. And I think there was just a couple steps too far in that direction. But point being, it sounds like that was more Ridley Scott than Damon Lindelof. And that this thing with Vickers, this was one of these instances where he said, like, Damon Lindelof was like, why doesn't she just like turn? This doesn't make sense. And Ridley Scott was sort of like, we're not going to argue about it. That's what's happening. And then I think a lot of decisions in the movie kind of went like that. Like, you're not going to win an argument with Ridley Scott.
I just like, I watched it again this morning and I was just trying to like rationalize in my head, like, why would you not move that way? Especially after you just saw the other person do it, that's
the part that really underlines it. Cause like, you know, if you get swept up in the moment and then maybe you think back later and go, oh, that's kind of weird. But it's because that's how Shaw saves herself that then you're left going like, well, yeah, why didn't both of you do that immediately?
It's almost to the point for me of like that Austin Powers guy who gets hit by the steamroller.
That's exactly it is. It's the same joke, and the pacing is perfect. It's just unintentionally perfect comedic pacing. And this is the other thing too. So like, you know, we've talked a little bit about how, all right, the film raises questions, it doesn't answer, and da. But I think even if you're somebody who doesn't like this movie and you can maybe make the leap with all of that stuff, the part that I just can't look past with this film, the most glaring issue for me is this is one of those movies where you have a lot of characters who are making very, very stupid decisions just to move the plot forward.
Sure.
And this thing with Vickers is one instance of that. Obviously, the moment everybody points to, the big one, is the way that the two scientists treat the appearance of that alien snake thing,
right,
which is just it's Looney Tunes. That's a legitimate complaint that, you know, I think for the first half hour, 40 minutes, this is a really solid film. And it's when they get into when they find the dead body of the engineer that it's like right there, it becomes a different movie almost. And this group of characters we've been following, a lot of them turn into completely different characters. They stop behaving like scientists and they start behaving like camp counselors in a Friday the 13th movie. Like, it's like they're scientists the way Dr. Dre is a doctor. It doesn't make any sense. And then the other thing too is like, if you're going to stage a sequence where one of them gets lost, don't make it the character who just mapped the entire location. That's absurd. And the biologist who now has no interest in this unbelievably well-preserved alien specimen in front of it. It's just like, what did you guys think you were here to do? Why are you running away like children now? That part really bothers me.
Yeah, no, I as much as I actually really like this movie, I do point to this movie a lot when I talk about certain movies that, like, I'll go with you to Looney Tunes Town in your movie if you stick with your logic from opening to closing credits. Like, totally. Just keep me in your world, keep me in the logic. But yeah, those two, you don't run away from a dead alien and then go pet a clearly alive one. That makes no sense other than it's like, yeah, it just had to happen. But again, like watching it today, I was like, they could have done this exact same scene and probably made it even more tension filled if they didn't see that this live creature was like slurping up behind them. Like, it just makes no sense why he had to even interact with it on like a I see you level because the audience already knows what's going to happen.
Totally. He's treating it like it's a stray kitten, like, oh, hey, beautiful. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. And meanwhile, the whole audience is sitting there going like, dude, that is a demon vagina on a stick. Back away. And I remember this. There were a couple of moments where you could feel the entire audience having the same reaction to the film. And sometimes it was a really great, like, okay, the movie is clearly working. And then there were other moments like this where you could just hear everyone in the theater going like, what the hell? What are you doing? Like, it doesn't make sense. It really pulls me out of the film. And like you said, you could accomplish this story beat in a way that was consistent with how these characters had been set up.
The other thing, while we're just crapping on this movie that I actually really like, the other thing that watching that always just makes me just like pound my head, like, why? He clearly, like, as much as I'm looking at you right now, sees him stick his finger in that drink. He doesn't bother to turn around, but it's like, what are you doing? Like, hide it a little bit. He like literally puts his whole freaking fist in there, and then it's like, here you go.
Stirring it around right in front of his face. Lip, lip, lip.
Like, what a weird choice. Like, drinks, like, bottoms up. Like, no, you just stuck your finger in it, you dirty robot. Like, go get me a clean glass. I get it. The audience had to know. But again, that's another thing. Like, I certainly would not call this by any stretch of the imagination lazy filmmaking. But there are some moments that just felt like you could have just got a real quick pickup shot of the finger putting it in, and we could just assume that he had turned his back for a second and done it. Like, why'd you have to show me that?
That's so funny. In my memory, that's how I remember that moment, is that David has his back turned and then there's just this quick close-up of bloop. And then, watching it again, I was like, oh no, it's a medium shot. They're both in there and he just does it right in front of his face. Unintentionally
hilarious. It's like the world's worst date rapist. Like, hello, ladies. Like, come on, man. What are you doing? But like, again, like these are things that like, I don't want to call it lazy, but it's like, there's these little things that could like, honestly, if you had changed even just the scientist, change that scene, I feel like you actually would probably take a lot of, because I feel like that moment did lose a lot of people when we were watching it. I think that's when people started to be like, come on, like you said. And I feel like it's those little things that could be fixed. Maybe he'll do a Prometheus special edition, George Lucas style someday.
You know, I was just thinking that there is a little bit of George Lucas in Ridley Scott these days, and not even just the parallels of, returning to this franchise with these prequels that aren't as well received, but also just in kind of the revisionist history that he's now writing, where he gives interviews and he talks about his plans for these films and then the ones that are, that he has yet to make, and he'll directly contradict things he had said in a previous interview, and it's like, you're on record. And she's like, oh, no, I didn't say that. This was the plan. That there's a lot of similarities. And also, what you were just saying about a few tweaks and all of this, that even as an actor, they must have realized some of this stuff didn't totally add up. But again, at this point in time, Ridley Scott, that's just not a guy that there are probably a lot of people standing around saying no to, or even raising a lot of these concerns. So
there's one other thing about this movie, because I do want to like shift focus and talk about the things that I really do like. In fact, I want to shift to the cast, but one of the cast does not work for me at all. And it's the worst old age makeup I've ever seen, which is Guy Pearce. Honestly, this movie is one of the most beautiful movies like shot that I can remember in the last like 10 years. And when you see that old age makeup of Wayland in there, you're like, this is a different movie. This isn't the same movie.
No, so I know the original plan was, they cast Guy Pearce because in one of the earlier versions of the script, there were scenes where he appeared as a young man. And so you cast a young actor and then you have the old age makeup. Okay. I also read that Max von Sydow was originally going to play that part, which would have been
choice.
Incredible. And then even if you want Guy Pearce to play the younger version, I would much rather that you just still cast a different older actor for old man Wayland, and it would work just fine. That's another thing that really, really pulls me out of the film.
I just don't understand how the production design can be so jaw-dropping. It's like, did you just not, did you run out of money? Did you not see that? No one was like, hey, we may have gone a pinch too far on the makeup. Like the Emperor looks better than
yes,
it
absolutely
like that
does.
Bad.
We had the Great America, the Six Flags theme parks had a promotional campaign, like almost 20 years ago, where it was a young woman that they dressed up as an old man, and then she would like dance to techno music.
We've all been scarred by that commercial.
Okay, so that's what Guy Pearce reminds me of in this movie. I think the Six Flags mascot was a more convincing effect.
So that didn't work for me, but man, like your heavy hitters in this movie, the Noomi, how am I saying her name? I've said it
Noomi
different
Rapace
5 times.
is how I always say it, but yeah, I don't know.
I'm gonna say my girl Noomi, she killed it. Fassbender, I just think he carries this movie. I even love Idris Elba, who can't decide what accent he's doing from scene to scene.
I love Idris Elba. I loved him on The Wire. I really became a fan when I discovered that BBC show Luther, and I watched that and just thought like, wow, what can't this guy do? And then I heard his accent in this movie, and I was like, oh, well, there's something. There's maybe the one thing he can't do.
I can't believe I never noticed it until this watch this morning, where it was like, sure, you have to get to the ship real quick. And I was like, whoa. Like, it was like, there's joke, because I watched The Masked Singer, because I'm the lowest common denominator trash, that people who have British accents that try to do American accents always put like a Southern twang on it for whatever reason, probably because same reason when we do British accents, people are like, that's not what it sounds like at all. But it definitely shows through on some of those moments, especially where he's like getting more heated. I think he goes back and forth between Texas and like Liverpool. But he's great. I think he's great. He's the only one in this movie that I'm like, okay, you actually feel like a real person, like a real dude who would probably be someone I could relate to.
Yeah, this is such a great cast, and that even the characters that don't totally work, those two scientists, Rafe Spall is the biologist, and oh man, I'm blanking on Sean Harris is the guy with the mohawk. He's the villain in some of the Mission Impossible movies. Just an unbelievable actor, and they are good in this. They're just, some of these roles are underwritten, some of them are nonsensical, but the actors, most of them are all doing a really, really great job. I agree with you. This is a really solid cast.
Yeah, I think Noomi, that was actually what bummed me out the most about Alien Covenant, was like they had said, oh, she is going to be in it. And I was like, great, she was the best part of Prometheus. I really want to see how that character is like handling this world that just, kind of pooped all over her in this first movie. And then they poop all over us by her just being a corpse. Just
dies off screen. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. Did you know that Charlize Theron was originally going to play Shaw, and then there were scheduling conflicts with Mad Max Fury Road, so she had to drop out. Mad Max got delayed again, so she rejoined the production, but at that point they had cast Noomi Rapace, so then she gets moved into the Vickers role. But that's kind of an interesting thing to consider, is what the movie would have been with Charlize Theron as the lead.
I don't know if I would have bought it as much, to be honest with you. I think that's what Noomi brings, is like, for some reason, she just has this aura about her that I believe, like, the conviction of this mission for her is very much personal, and like I need to have my beliefs reaffirmed. And I'm not saying Charlize Theron is not a great actress, because she is. Like, was it Monster? Is like, she's fantastic in it. But I just don't know if I would buy it as much with Charlize. I'm not her biggest critic, but I'm also not her biggest fan.
No, I love what Noomi has a couple of absolutely gut-wrenching scenes, pun intended, I guess, with one I'm thinking of in particular. But I mean, so she absolutely sells the shit out of what is my favorite scene in the movie, which is the whole, when she has to remove the
surgery.
Yeah. But then also her reaction to Holloway when Vickers taking a flamethrower to him, like that whole scene. She's incredible in those moments. The movie really does ask a lot from her at certain points. And yeah, she gets saddled with some stilted dialogue here and there, but where it counts, like when she, in those bigger moments, she really, really rises to the occasion.
Yeah, I really think and I think they might have used this in one of the trailers or TV spots, but just like that moment where she's just like, we were wrong. We came here. Like that to me is like quintessential, like space, sci-fi horror. Like this idea of like opening up to a new world and then that new world being a nightmare. Like I think she sells it a lot, and it is tough. She had a tough job. It's tough to go from a scene that's so intense, like the surgery, which if I had read that as a script, I'd be like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever read. This is stupid, and it's going to look stupid. Like a space abortion. This movie has a space coat hanger. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But she sells it, and she makes it work, and then immediately has to go straight into exposition land as if her freaking like large intestine's not just like stapled up inside of her right now.
I know, yeah.
Like it's like I think she did a great job, and like I said, I think Idris does a great job. Fassbender, I think like that's another one where I almost feel like Ridley must have pulled him aside and been like, here's a bunch of stuff that is never going to be in the movie, but just so you know, because he's playing that character as if he's 4 steps ahead of everybody else, and we never quite get to what his end game was, other than we just have to assume that he at some point became somewhat sentient, I guess, and was very like jealous of these other people that they, he's the smartest one in the room, but yet he's the one that's treated like dog crap, and his dad or, Wayland is kind of pushing him to, date rape the drug, like in the worst way, or the drink in the worst way possible. I just think I think he has a great performance that, like a lot of these characters, actually, now that we're talking about it, are just saddled with a lot of like plot inconsistencies and maybe some stilted dialogue. But I still think even with that, like just even that first scene of him watching that movie and wanting to be, be like that character, like that's all great stuff.
That's some of the best stuff in the movie, is him wandering around the ship before everyone else wakes up. And Michael Fassbender is definitely the standout of this film, and this was at a moment in time where, I mean, he had a few in a row here where it was just like, wow, this is someone to watch. This guy's incredible. And then it was like within the next few years, just a series of very questionable choices where it was just like, oh, what are you doing? You could have done anything. Who are your agents? What's happening?
Right.
But what I like about David is I know they very specifically locked into this idea that unlike other androids, that he was not interested in becoming human, that's not what was driving him. And I think that's awesome. And it also kind of made me realize that when you look at what they do with David in this film and the next film, it kind of starts to feel like Ridley Scott would have been more at home returning to the Blade Runner franchise. And I'm glad he didn't, because I love the Blade Runner sequel that we got. I really, really love it. But the themes that he's exploring, the stuff that really seems to interest him, because he's definitely more interested in David than he is in, all the alien stuff, that it kind of feels like he came back to the wrong series.
Well, it's also kind of a bummer that, and I know we keep talking about it, but you almost can't not talk about it. It's kind of a bummer that this performance of David is now kind of lumped into his performance again as, I don't know if there was another droid. He was David and another one in Covenant. And It's just so comically terrible what they made him say and do with fingering the flute and all this stupid stuff that it almost kind of undoes the goodwill of the great performance in this movie. Like, you just can't get away from it. So yeah, I really like the cast. That's some good stuff. The other thing I was going to say that I really love about this movie is the score. Like when the movie just starts and there's this hum and you think that's going to be like the first note of whatever you're going to hear. And then the trumpet comes in and it's almost like in a different key. And you automatically, like, just from hearing that hum and that trumpet on different keys, like, you're like, I feel like a sense of like awe, but also a sense of like unease about all of this. And I just think like there's something about that first scene and really the score in that scene that, like, to me, it's still one of my favorite tracks. Like, I don't think I downloaded the whole soundtrack, but I definitely have that first track, and I listen to it all the time because it's just so beautiful on its own.
It's great. The whole score is really wonderful. And I agree that it just from those opening moments, like I said, I loved that this didn't feel like any other Alien movie, that this was something with its own identity. I love that. The music totally reflects that. And then this time I was noticing that even when they, first discover the engineer corpse and when they're just walking through those tunnels and everything, they're, these very low strings, and the way it's so subtly building tension. It's a really, really wonderful score.
Doesn't it make you just scratch your head though, with like the subtleties of things like that and the very like masterful building of tension that then you would, like, on the flip side, just have these guys touch a snake? That's why it just feels, it's almost like, did someone just step in for like a week? Like, did he have like the flu for a week and someone just came in and was like, just get the shots real fast before he comes back,
It's really astonishing that, Ridley Scott is a guy who obviously cares about the details of certain things, that, all the way that, this engineer facility, all of the artwork and stuff that we see on the walls and all, I know he knows the history of all of that and he's thought about it, and the art direction, all of this stuff that I know he pays a ton of attention to, because actually my favorite thing about the Prometheus Blu-ray that I have is the documentary about the making of the film, which is so interesting and so extensive, and oh my God, it's so awe-inspiring. And then it's like you just kind of wish he had that same devotion to detail when it came to certain parts of the script, that there is a shorthand to some of this of like, everybody's here, but we got to get him here. So then just like, blah, that, yeah, I don't know. It's too bad that attention to detail doesn't extend to some of these more important areas. Cause yeah, that scene with the snake, it's like the score should drop out and it should just be like cartoon, like zoinks and slipping on banana peels. That's the way they're behaving.
Yeah. I think for me, I've said it a bunch. I really like this movie. I think I like 75% of this movie. It really piques my interest. It gets me thinking. It's that 25% that keeps me from loving it. But I definitely I said this in the Batman v Superman episode. I have a soft spot for creators that take big swings, and sometimes you're going to miss. And sometimes you're going to think you're hit a homer and it's, a ground rule double. And I think that's what happened with Prometheus. But I don't think that, when you talk about, movies of the last 5 years and you talk about some of like the bad ones and some of the worst ones that come out, or the ones that like make you pull your hair out, somehow Prometheus has found its way on that list, to the point where you talk to some people like, oh, like I remember specifically we were going to do a news story once on SJU about they were going to do, I don't know if it happened or not, but they were going to do a comic series following Prometheus. And it was just met with eye rolls and just like, oh God, no, not that. I'm like, wait a second. This isn't like, Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern. Like, this isn't like horrible. I think people give this movie a harder time than maybe it deserves. And also I think it's kind of the Batman Forever, Batman and Robin thing, where it's like somehow Covenant and Prometheus get lumped into one like those other two do. So you kind of forget, like, people think, I know I'm going on a tangent here, but people think that Batman Forever is like all campy. I'm like, no, there's actually a lot of darkness. I think you've just in your mind combined the two, where it's like, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in Prometheus and there's a lot of bad stuff in Covenant, and I think you're combining the terribleness of the two. I just don't think Prometheus deserves to be on this like worst of list.
No, I don't either. And Covenant was definitely a movie that made me appreciate Prometheus even more than I already did. And you and I are in 100% agreement that I admire the big swings. And even if they miss, I think the very worst thing any movie can be is boring, forgettable, just something that, got rolled off the assembly line. So even if, it doesn't totally work, I would still rather watch an interesting failure than something that's just like totally bland, middle of the road. And so that's something that's kind of been great about most of the Alien franchise, like up to a point. And it's a shame that they got so reactive to, especially in the case of Prometheus, you can feel how reactive Covenant is to the feedback this movie got. But even going back further, this was a franchise that was so exciting because every filmmaker that they brought in was able to put their stamp on it. James Cameron made a very different movie than Ridley Scott did. And even though David Fincher's movie got micromanaged to hell, like I said, you can still see a lot of David Fincher in that movie. And so it's as different from the first two as they were from each other. And then it's like, when it's like you said, you take those big swings, some of them are going to hit, some of them are going to miss, but the takeaway shouldn't be this very superficial read of, oh, what did we do wrong there? Like, let's just start playing it safe. Let's just start doing the greatest hits version of Alien, which I think you can see with Resurrection as far back as that. It's just like, let's just kind of combine the stuff people liked about those earlier movies. That's such a boring way to go. And it was like the misread of Prometheus. It wasn't that there were no traditional aliens or face huggers or any of that. That's not why that movie went. That's not what people didn't like about it. Like that. And so I think it's always a shame when you can see them get too reactive about stuff like that, and then how the way they address it usually seems to just be, let's just settle back on what worked before. And that's how you just get these watered down versions, this less and less potent versions of this stuff that you loved.
Yeah, and like just even watching it, again, it was like, man, I know this was only like 7 years ago, but this is kind of the last huge movie that I can remember where it's like they built those sets. Like, this all feels real. It doesn't feel like I'm, in, as much as I love the Star Wars movies, I can admit that it, like, a lot of that just doesn't feel like anything because it's all clearly fake. But Prometheus, like, I don't know. It's just like, I don't want to be like the old man on his lawn, but it's just like they don't really make them like that anymore. And that was only 7 years ago.
I know, it's crazy. I had the same thought that even just in the last few years, the idea of scope with a movie, I don't know that it really means the same thing that it used to, because you don't even need that big of a budget anymore to create these like CGI vistas and to try and, make a world look huge. But this movie is the scale of it feels enormous because they are standing in the middle of these gigantic sets and you can feel it. It's the same thing that is so amazing about the original Alien. There's just this tactile feel to everything. And, it's Darius Wolski, the DP, just shot the hell out of this. This is an incredible looking film.
Yeah, and it makes me hope that, maybe some time away from this, people will come back, they'll find the things that they like about it, and maybe, as tough as it is, like, I really do feel like a lot of my enjoyment comes from my, like, divorcing myself of any thought of, like, Alien. Like, I think this does work for me so well as a standalone because I'm not an Alien fanatic. I think to this day, I've seen Alien 1 maybe twice, 3 times. I know I've only seen Aliens once, and I didn't like it as much. I guess that's another episode. But yeah, a lot of people love Aliens, and I'm like, yeah, it's fine. But I think I like these movies that, even though this asks a lot of questions, doesn't answer a lot of them, has a lot of like bonehead moves, but I still, even this time when it was over, I just kind of sit there in silence and I think about like the bigger questions. I think about creation. I think about like, what would it be like, or where do we come from, and all these things. And I think even if the movie doesn't 100% succeed, I think a lot of like what it was at least trying to get me to think about succeeded. And for me, I think that's enough to say that I really like it.
Yeah, there are two alternate universes I wish I could dip into for just a second. One where they shot John Spaeth's original draft of this, because that's the one that I think got them the green light. They were all set, and then until they just made this decision of like, no, wait, we're going to bring in another writer and change it some more. I want to see what that original version looked like, because it does have a lot of these same great big ideas, but I think it was just a slightly more focused narrative. And then the other universe I want to dip into is the one where the reaction to this was a little bit more enthusiastic, and we did get to see what Prometheus 2 and 3 looked like. That if this is the first act of a larger story, let's let that play out to, its intended conclusion, rather than living in a world where instead we got this ham-fisted like Alien sequel, when that's clearly not the movie Ridley Scott wanted to make. But that is another thing about the film that bugs me, is this: we do live in this era where, the idea of just telling a complete story, and then if people like it, let's figure out how to do another one. There are so many movies that start from this point of, this is the first in a trilogy, that they just know from the onset that we're planning on sequels. I think when it's Marvel, that's a very different situation. I think when it's Star Wars, very different situation. With stuff like this, I just feel like maybe get a little bit more focused on, like, why don't you just worry about this one? Why don't we just really work on this one? And then if it hits, we'll figure out where to take it from here. Because that's what I kind of love about the early Alien movies too, is it's just some of those end and you go like, it's a real challenge. How the hell do you pick up that baton? Where do we run with it from here? And sometimes it's in a really great way, like Aliens. And then sometimes it's in kind of a head-scratching way, like Alien 3. But I like that challenge. I think that's more interesting and more satisfying for an audience to go in and feel like you got a complete story with maybe some hints of where it might go from here, versus, hey, better stuff on the way.
Well, I hope if you're listening to this and you've made it this far, that you give Prometheus a second shot. Maybe you'll watch it again and you'll feel the exact same way. Maybe you'll have some new thoughts. But in the meantime, if you need some time before you gear up to watch Prometheus again, Chris, I do want to talk real quick about the stuff that you're doing, because I have been talking about Hey, Do You Remember a lot on SJU, because I just love the show that you do. And I think you guys did Alien, yeah?
We did, yeah. That's one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, you guys should definitely go check out that and all the other ones. If you don't know what the show is, it's just you guys just talking about movies. It's so simple, right?
A movie or TV series that we grew up with. So, usually something from the 80s or 90s. We talk about how we remembered it, and then we see how it holds up, because usually they're two very different things.
And I know a lot of you guys listening, you're the Screen Junkies fans, you're the Collider fans, you guys are like the real movie fans. I think you'll dig this show. I think you and Carlos and Donna, you have such great movie minds. You always think of story things that even sometimes I don't pick up on, like that. I think you pitched something for Batman Returns, my favorite Batman. I was like, damn it, Chris, you're right. That actually would be better. Get out of my head. And on top of that, you also do a cool show that I really like, Rogues Gallery, where you run down, you kind of do deep dives into some of, not just comic book or sci-fi, but all types of villains, right?
Yeah, so it's, just like you said, we take villain, anti-hero, misunderstood monster from pop culture, and then really explore it. And so it's an excuse to, either look at an entire franchise, like we had an episode about Candyman. We did an episode about Khan from Star Trek and got to compare and contrast the different interpretations of that. And that's a fairly new show. We just started, but we're having a ton of fun with it. I would love it if people would go and check that out.
Yeah, I listened to the one on Khan, being a big Star Trek fan, and I absolutely loved it. So you guys, I recommend it. And if I recommend it, I don't give a shit about shilling for anything that I don't like, because I don't get a dime from any of this. So that I actually really like this stuff. So go check it out. And while you're at it, don't forget, this is coming out in the time, doing the add the one, carry the two. By this time, New York Comic Con is coming up, and I will be there on the Screen Junkies panel, where we will be unleashing the entire documentary of our Galaxy Quest that we've been sitting on. You guys have been asking to see. It's finished. We're looking back at Galaxy Quest. We got the whole cast. Everyone's in it talking about the movie. We will be doing a panel. I'll also show you some new stuff that I'm working on at Screen Junkie. So if you're at New York Comic Con, come to our panel. And then the next week, I will be at LA Comic Con doing the show with the Nerd Goat Boys, where we will reboot Batman. And somewhere in there, we're going to have to put out an episode where we talk about Joker, because we got to talk about that, guys. That's coming up. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. Follow you. Where do we follow you? Where do you like to be followed?
I'm probably most active on Instagram at Christopher Schrader. And then you can find all of the podcasts and the short films and all this other stuff I work on at 27thletterproductions.com.
And if you still want to follow him, we'll dox him later and you can just peek in his window. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you guys, hopefully at the con, but if not, right here next week.